William the First of England and Duke of Normandy was born in around 1027. The ruthlessness that William was to demonstrate later in life was a trait learned from a tough upbringing. Becoming duke at a young age, he was a target for powerful men in Normandy. He came very close to being assassinated one night when the man supervising him was murdered next to him as he slept. William had to fight to keep hold of Normandy, first with the aid of the French king, Henry I, and then later on he had to fight against the French king. In these early years, William would have learned what it took to keep hold of power when surrounded by men wishing to take it from him. He also would have learned the military attributes which would help transform William into a king. Whilst he was still Duke of Normandy, William crossed the Channel over to England in about 1053, where, or so William claimed, he was promised by Edward the Confessor that he would succeed as King of England on the old king's death. Whether that's true or not is debatable, but as I mentioned in my second video on the Anglo-Saxon kings, I believe Edward would have seen Harold Godwinson as preferable to succeed him. First of all, he was English and the most powerful man in England, and therefore one of the most respected, and also he was Edward's son-in-law. Harold himself ended up as captive of William, where, although treated with hospitality, a pledge to allow William to succeed him was extracted before William allowed Harold to return to England. This pledge was not going to stand for much for Harold, though, and he could easily claim that the pledge was extracted from him under duress, and therefore he could dismiss any claims that William had made. And so it proved on the old king's death in early January 1066, Harold immediately had himself crowned king, and the pledge that he had made William in Normandy was completely forgotten. Harold's actions could not have come as much of a surprise to William, whose response was delayed by bad fortune with the weather. There was also another claimant to the throne to complicate matters. This was Harold III of Norway, otherwise known as Hardrada. He was a giant of a man who had had something of an extraordinary military career, which had taken him as far as the Byzantine Empire, where he had served in the Varangian Guard. When he was invited to invade England by Harold Godwinson's problematic brother Tostig, Hardrada duly obliged, and had initial military success. Hardrada defeated an English army at the Battle of Fulford before he eventually succumbed to the English king's men at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in September of 1066. Whilst the English king was defeating the King of Norway in the north of England, the weather was finally blowing in Duke William of Normandy's favour, and he landed successfully at the other side of the country at Pevensey. Word soon got to the English king of this second invasion, and here he made an error in judgment. Being a man of action, Harold wished to deal with the threat immediately, but his men had just won a hard-fought battle. A calmer approach would have been to allow his men to rest and recuperate. It was, after all, William who needed a quick battle. He was in a foreign land, and he did not have limitless men or supplies. If King Harold had delayed a little longer, hunger and desperation may well have set in for the Norman army. As it was, he set off immediately, and the rest is history that we all know. At the Battle of Hastings itself, things started off well for the English army. They had the positional advantage, being positioned at the top of the hill, and after repeated Norman attacks had been repulsed, it looked like they were about to win the day. But as the day drew on, it looked as if the Norman army were retreating, as a portion of the Normans appeared to be leaving the battle scene. Believing that they had won the day, the English army ran down the hill from where they were positioned and chased after the Normans that appeared to be retreating. However, the Normans doubled back and circled the English army that was following them. The English were now surrounded and faced great slaughter. In the midst of the battle, King Harold was supposedly struck in the eye by an arrow and died. Duke William of Normandy was now King of England. If after Hastings that William thought that the battle for England was over, then he was mistaken. After a shambolic coronation on Christmas Day 1066, William's reign would be met with repeated resistance from the English, particularly in the north. It was in 1070 that would see one of the most brutal and condemnation-worthy acts of the Middle Ages, now known as the Harrying of the North. Facing continued resistance to his rule, William marched his men northwards, where they laid waste to the land, burning and slaughtering indiscriminately as they went. Such was the devastation caused that large parts of the population were wiped out. And so desperate was the situation for the survivors that it is said they had to resort to cannibalism and eat the corpses at the side of roads. As he lay on his deathbed, William is said to have regretted his brutality, fearful of the judgment from God he believed was about to come. On the other hand, William had left a more praiseworthy legacy. His castle-building program can still be seen up and down the country today, with 3 examples of this local to me, and the most prominent of which can be seen in London today at the Tower of London, which still stands in good health. He was also an excellent administrator, and his skills here led to the creation of the Domesday Book. If he had shown more restraint in his handling of the northern rebellions, he would probably be regarded as one of England's greatest kings. But the sheer savagery of his response, even at a time where violence was not unexpected, is one that is still profoundly shocking. I thought I'd just end this video on William the Conqueror with just a general summary and an informal summary of William the Conqueror. I think, having thought about it a little bit and having studied the Saxons and produced a couple of videos on the Saxons, I think you can regard William the Conqueror actually as a usurper. I don't think he had any right to rule. I'm not convinced Edward the Confessor told him he was his heir. I think he sensed an opportunity. I think Harold Godwinson was far more fit and able to rule. He had more going for him. For a start, the violence of William the Conqueror's reign would have been avoided if Harold had kept hold of the throne. There would not have been as unified a resistance against Harold's reign as William's. I think Harold had earned the right, after years of service under Edward the Confessor, to succeed Edward, who had no heirs himself. Of course, Edward the Confessor has to accept some responsibility for the troubles of William the Conqueror. For a king to not have an heir, as we see throughout the Middle Ages and medieval period, it causes problems, not just in England but elsewhere as well. I think any king that doesn't produce heirs and ultimately leaves the throne to be contested has left a poor legacy, and I think Edward the Confessor has to be criticised for that. William the Conqueror, ultimately, I would regard actually as not a good king. Ultimately, he had the potential and the makings of a great king, as I said towards the end of the video, but his inability to, I would say, his inability to identify with the English population and not perhaps understand their frustrations and instead resort to violence to deal with them, I think is pretty deplorable, to be honest. And I've come to the conclusion that actually I'd actually regard him as a very poor king, in fact, even if I've said something to the contrary in the video. I think ultimately you'd have to call his reign a failure. And I think Harold Godwinson, ultimately, he has to take some responsibility for William's reign as well, and for the troubles it caused. But ultimately, as I mentioned in the video, he should have clung on to power, frankly. He should have won Hastings. His army should not have followed the Normans as they supposedly retreated. He shouldn't have marched down from the north of England straight away to meet William, because again, as I mentioned in the video, William was ultimately in a foreign land, in a potentially hostile land, and if he was to win the throne of England, he needed to meet Harold straight away, and that's what Harold provided with him. If Harold had perhaps stayed a little while in the north of England, then William may well have started having to resort to steal from the English and taking their property, essentially, and their lands in order to kind of provide for his army. And ultimately, that sort of behaviour would have alienated the land he was trying to conquer and rule over, and that would have played into Harold's hands because it would have increased his support. And also, by staying in the north of England, Harold could have built up his forces even more, because he would have lost men at Stamford Bridge. So the troubles of William the Conqueror's reign ultimately are down to the three men themselves: Edward the Confessor, Harold II, and obviously William the Conqueror. I have mentioned the good parts of William the Conqueror's reign, but I don't think they supersede the bad aspects of it. And also in the reign of his son, William II, that ultimately led to more infighting and civil war. So William the Conqueror's legacy isn't even that he provided a secure dynasty. He didn't. His son, William II, was deposed by Henry I, William the Conqueror's other son. And there was fighting between Henry I and Robert Curthose, William the Conqueror's oldest son. So it's not even like William provided a stable dynasty that lasted for a long time. It didn't. It only lasted under 100 years. Ultimately, William's legacy is not a great one. It's one of, in his reign, it's one of violence and cruelty. And then after he had died, it was one of infighting amongst his sons. And then further down the line, although you can't exactly blame him for what was to come during the reign of King Stephen, but there was more civil war amongst his grandchildren. So he has not left either a good legacy for himself, or he has not left a good family legacy either. I don't know if I've rambled in this last bit, but I just wanted to surmise my general thoughts on William the Conqueror and just add a little bit to the video, which I was quite aware was quite short. I could have put more detail in it, but I just thought that I thought I'd make this a kind of an introduction on William the Conqueror rather than a detailed video.